Hello, I'm Linda Barwick and I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, and I want to thank Uncle Alan Madden for his welcome to his country yesterday. I'm going to be talking to you today about virtualised song collections held in archives, but before I do some nitty-gritty around that, I just want to talk a bit more about the framework that I see these in. So the first thing to bear in mind is that what is being virtualised and put into archives and collections is only a partial record of song. These partial records are supported by very long histories of unwritten memory technologies, face-to-face learning and teaching of singing practices. It seems that song is a human universal, so we find it in many, many different cultural contexts, often being very highly prized for its ability to coordinate people and to touch some of the deepest aspects of our identity. So within this history of virtualised song, I just wanted to go through some of the technologies that have led to the archival objects. So from very early times in human history, we know that singing practices have gone on from all sorts of indirect evidence, but the earliest written evidence that I'm aware of is this 1400 BC hymn to Mikau, written in Babylonian cuneiform script, which is up in the top left there. These documents of singing practices seem to have been used predominantly as a performance aid or a learning aid perhaps, and what I'll call narrowcast, that is intended for use by a specialist audience of performers and I suppose music specialists of some sort. With the advent of printing technology and later music typesetting, lithographic reproduction, mechanical reproduction became possible, which allowed these documents to be reproduced in very large numbers and circulated, broadcast, that is, without necessarily looking at a specialist audience, but perhaps enabling a more widespread appreciation and performance of song. So still being used predominantly as a support for performance and learning and teaching. Things changed with the advent of sound recording technology and the subsequent dispersal of sound recordings and sound playback devices around the world. So analogue recordings in various formats are really intended for playback rather than as prompts to performance of the person using them, though of course they have been used as that, and I, like many other people, have memorised songs that I've learnt from recordings. However, from the point of view of production, they were mainly intended for developing consumer markets, people who would buy these technologies and also use them for consumer market, for mass media broadcasting, the ideas of aggregating song sales data to create the top 100 or whatever became an important part of that. By the by the time of the 1980s, songs entered into what we might really call the virtualised realm, that is digital song. And the, excuse me, and people transferred very often their analogue recording collections into personal digital collections using tools like Apple's iTunes and so on to create and store metadata and enable them to navigate their collections. But one of the things about these early digital collections was that what was being shared was actually files. And so that enabled people to reuse the digital files in all sorts of ways, creating mashups and also sharing files outside of the control of the music publishing industry, which wasn't too happy about it. So these days, most song collections are available online via streaming services rather than download services. So we can see that these cloud-based digital collections have become much more niche profiled consumer marketing. So for example, Facebook for some reason thinks that I'm a consumer of Bollywood movies and K-pop, not quite sure why. Whereas Spotify, unless I log in, just serves me up whatever is the most popular at the moment. So one of the things about all of these technologies is that they create objects that become collectible. And from very early times, these song objects became, and song object collections became gathered together in libraries and collections. It's also worth noting that all of these technologies could potentially be used for songs of others as well as one's own. So, and indeed, amongst the illustrations I have there are some very early ethnomusicological, we might say, collections of songs. So today, online heritage song collections exist in a very crowded online media landscape. Usually these are created by government bodies or not-for-profits, or perhaps publishing, as in the For the Sake of a Song website that's developed at the University of Sydney Library out of the book that Alan Marrett and I compiled some years ago with members of various Daly region communities to document Wonga songs. I'm not going to talk more about these now, but just to say that the archival song collections that we're interested in at PARADISEC are competing, in a sense, with all these other platforms that are serving up songs online. One of the reasons that sharing songs from archival collections can be problematic is that the roots of many archives are colonial. I have a quote here from my PARADISEC colleagues, Amanda Harris, Stephen Gagau, Jodie Kell, Nick Teberger and Nicholas Ward, regarding some of the ways in which they've approached collaborations of speaker communities in the archive, and drawing attention to the fact that the locking up of cultural heritage in archives by outsiders holding community knowledge is a model that leaves the power over community records in the hands of outsiders. And they call for bringing speaker communities inside the archive, which does not just enhance the archive, but has the potential to disrupt its power structures. So keeping or preservation of language and culture, including song, can only happen through community-led active use. And reuse or interaction with archival materials can be part of such cultural development, but it cannot be all that's involved. Archives can facilitate this through a number of strategies that I'm going to go into a bit more detail about now. So first one is developing healthy community relationships. So rather than having a one-way flow from speaker community through collector to the archive, the model that's been developed by the PARADISEC team and published in the article I mentioned before involves a much more complex but also ultimately much more enriching relationship between the speaker and the archive. And importantly, autonomous action by the speaker community to reuse or interact with cultural records for purposes like cultural revitalisation. Another strategy that I believe we should all be working towards is co-building archives with community depositors. Here's Payi Linda Ford, who we will have heard from or will be hearing from in this conference, working with Jodie Kell and I to develop the structure of her deposit in PARADISEC. We need to make it easy for community members to access, manage and interact with archival materials. And that might involve actually tailoring the means of returning materials according to the wishes and limitations perhaps of community access points. So in Central Australia, archival returns of sensitive material on dumb media like USB flash drives can be preferred for sensitive material that enable people to deal with the songs privately initially before sharing them more widely. And of course, Nick Teberger and his collaborators have done wonderful work with developing these portable Wi-Fi points on Raspberry Pi technology to which smartphones can connect so people can interact with collections when there are issues with online access. Partnerships with local cultural centres is another really important strategy that PARADISEC's pursued for a long time. The picture here is of me with some of my collaborators at the Museo Italiano dell'Immaginario Folclorico in Piazza al Cerchio, which has been an access point for a lot of my own collection of Italian Maggio song performance. This is me with Umberto Bertolini and Giuseppina Grandini in front of a display of some of my Maggio materials there. Now, the importance of local cultural centres is really building a positive ecosystem around interactions with archival materials. So keeping that local control, enabling the deep local expertise and networks that support sharing of archival materials. These facilities can also coordinate activities and events for around the archival materials, such as sharing of them more publicly on occasion. And in return, it's important to listen to what they need. So, for example, in Piazza al Cerchio, they've got very similar problems to what we find in other remote areas, lack of infrastructure, vulnerability to funding shortfalls, and so on. So these are ways that we can band together to help support our sector. Another strategy is embedding community perspectives within management. We've heard from Stephen Gagawan. We'll hear more from him later on. This quote from the PARADISEC Toksave podcast draws attention to his dual role as a community person and as an archivist. And his closing comment there, I think is important. This is a global village now. We've got to be part of that. Just a few user perspectives that have will have turned up in other presentations, I suspect. So Grace Hull, again from the PARADISEC Talk Saber podcast, wonderful interview with Grace and some beautiful music from the collections to enjoy there. But the thing I wanted to draw attention to is the way in which archival song, listening to archival song, supports cultural identity. It's still in her, she comments. It's still in me. Another way that we've shared archival recordings is through fair publications, and this quote from Payi Linda Ford again recounts a family day out with her Muck Muck family, in which the soundtrack of the Wonga CDs that we prepared in collaboration with the communities in Bellew and Wadair was being used as part of a much richer, multifaceted cultural learning day for some of the younger generations of her family. Finally, another comment from Johnny Nunyama-Devili, who co-presented with Sally yesterday, and this quote is from a presentation that he did with Sally some years ago. The thing I wanted to draw attention to here is the wonderfully eloquent way he talks about how he interacts with archival song records to support his own creative practice, using recordings of himself as well as part of that process, but underpinned by interactions with the older people who really understand the song practices that he's participating in. So to conclude, I want to remind you of some of the things I've talked about. So this history of sharing of archival song is part of what we all have to deal with as archivists and as researchers who are interacting with these repositories. We need to acknowledge the colonial histories of many of our collections and the resultant ethical and emotional issues that arise in bridging community access. And there's much more that needs to be done to develop and refine some of the strategies and practices that I've talked about, that PARADISEC has used. And finally, there is evidence that community users are actually finding the reuse of these virtualised archival songs to be a productive and positive experience. We tend to hear a lot of negative stories, but I think that some of the positive stories also need to be part of that conversation. And like many others, my ultimate aspiration is that these archival songs should be free to re-enter and enliven the realm of the face-to-face.